Welcome in, everyone. Christian Jackson here with special guest Theo Lawson, who covered Gonzaga for the Spokesman Review. Theo, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, appreciate you having me on, and I like the backdrop there with the Zags jersey. Is that a 23? So who? That's
Zach Norvell Jr., which is a random pull. This was when I had my jersey phase, though.
Yeah, he's a new assistant coach for Gonzaga, so he's
he is now.
Yeah, still. So I saw him on Saturday, and yeah, I think he's someone who they really like on their staff. So he was a grad assistant, and then kind of worked his way into the official coaching staff now. So,
well, dating back to when Zach Norvell was there until last season, what was it? A 8-year streak of making the Sweet 16 every year. That streak ends, but man, it feels like this wasn't the year that it should have ended. There was like the greatest 8 seed of all time. You have to play Houston in the second round, and a 25-8 regular season where you lost 3 games in overtime, just bad variance. In overtime games, another top 10 offense, another top 10 finish on KenPom. So if that's a down year for Gonzaga, it just kind of speaks to what Mark Few's built there. But coming off that last season, how do you think Mark Few is feeling, and just what do you think his approach to this offseason was?
Yeah, like you said, I mean, I think they feel like they should have been another second weekend team last year. 0-8 in 2 possession games, and just could never, make a shot at the end of a game and kind of get things to go their way, and then still, came up just short of beating a really good Houston team. So, really, just kind of unfortunate the way it ended, and not being able to kind of extend that Sweet 16 streak, but they really had to retool this roster, losing 4 starters and a bunch of kind of seniors who had been around for a while. When you have to replace, what they would all say was the nation's top point guard and Ryan Nembhard, followed by Nolan Hickman, who was a 4-year guy, and Ben Gregg, who's kind of a program guy that was around dating back to the last Final Four and national championship game. So really just a lot of program guys that they had to replace. And it does feel like a very new team, despite the fact that you have 2 kind of solid returners in Braden Huff and Graham Mike, and other guys who were around last year but just weren't playing. Braden Smith, Still Venters, and Jalen Worley, who Still Venters hasn't played in 3 years. Braden Smith hasn't played in a year, and Worley hasn't played in a year since he finished at Florida State. So at least you have some guys who have been around, kind of had a year to get their feet wet. They know the system a little bit more than some of the newcomers, and then you add Adam Miller and Mario Saint Superi from Spain, who I think is going to be a big piece for him at point guard, kind of a combo guard, but more of a point guard, and then hopefully Tyon Grant Foster soon.
Let's start with Tyon Grant Foster. So we were talking before recording about, so now he is in Spokane, and he's allowed to practice with the team, and signs are looking positive for him to play with this team. So presuming he is able to play, tell me just kind of the approach to getting him acclimated, coming in October, and what he brings to the table.
Yeah, so he was cleared to practice last week. He got up to Spokane. I believe he was in, he's kind of split his time between his hometown of Kansas City and Arizona, where he was obviously at Grand Canyon the last 2 years. I think he was in Phoenix and kind of got the call that he could come up and practice, and so I think he moved up here last week. He was able to practice twice with the team before they had their annual preseason event, Craziness in the Kennel. Wasn't supposed to play in that, but I guess was kind of just pleading to the coaches, hey, I really want to participate in your scrimmage, and it's just kind of a really informal 20-minute scrimmage that they go through. And so he actually started in that and played about 14 minutes. It was obviously rusty, went 0 for 4, and you can't read too much into stat lines from these preseason scrimmages, but he's up here now. He's practicing, so he's going to have a chance to work with teammates and get to know the system. And it's a lot different training by yourself or training with your personal coach back home in Kansas City and actually working with the team. So he's getting acclimated, and we're not sure quite when he's going to get cleared, and we don't know for sure if he's going to get cleared. But all signs are pointing toward him probably getting cleared. The fact that he was granted this practice waiver and he's up here now, I think they are factoring him in, and I really think he's going to be kind of the X factor for this team because he can do so many things that a lot of the roster can't. I think he's going to be your best 2-way player. He really showed the ability to kind of interrupt passing lanes at Grand Canyon. I think led that team in steals and was kind of like a borderline all-WAC defensive team type player. And then he obviously can create for himself. Not the most consistent 3-point shooter in the world, but he can knock down 3-pointers and he can play in transition. So I think he's going to be able to do a lot of things that a lot of guys on this team can't do, as far as being kind of elite at 3 or 4 different things, where I think you kind of have a lot of specialists on this team right now.
I know maybe Mark hasn't said a lot about his fit just because of the uncertainty, but I'm curious if at Grand Canyon, he was a guy that Bryce Drew would just kind of let go hoop and just try to get to the free throw line and create for himself and do whatever he wanted. And when I go back and watch him, the things that pop out are, one, his handle is so good, and it's so hard to keep him from getting all the way to the rim. But two, like, I think he's kind of an underrated passer, and like maybe with some more structure, I could see him kind of being more of a facilitator. Do you expect him to? And then the 3-point shot was bad last year. I saw that he shot 38% on catch and shoot threes the season before. So there's a glimmer of hope of him, becoming an off-ball threat. But I kind of throw a few different things at you there. But what do you think about him kind of fitting into this roster, especially when you're losing Nembhard and you got Braden Smith, and we'll get to these guys, but it's kind of unclear who will have the ball the most.
Yeah, I think a lot of guys, come to Gonzaga from previous stops, maybe they had the ball in their hands a lot. I think even Caleb Battle comes to mind last year coming to Gonzaga from a place like Arkansas where, he had the ball in his hands a little bit more, was taking a few more shots and maybe not taking a lot of inefficient shots, where I think you come to Gonzaga and you're going to play with two. I mean, Graham Ike is a preseason All-American type candidate, and I think Braden Huff, once people get to see him more, he's kind of been in the shadows a little bit more. But he's at that same level as Graham Ike, where he's going to just draw so much defensive attention. I think a guy like Tyon Grant Foster, who, every scouting report, he's been on the last two years at Grand Canyon. He's been the top guy on that scouting report. And so teams are planning for him, whereas, he comes to Gonzaga, teams are probably planning for Graham Ike first, and then maybe Braden Huff second, maybe Tyon second. But I think he's just going to have a lot more freedom to kind of play the way that he's played and create and drive to the basket. And I think there's going to be a lot more open for him. And you mentioned the catch and shoot. I just can't imagine how many more catch and shoot chances he's going to get because, defenders are sagging into the paint and trying to stop that duo of Huff and Ike. So I think, most players come to Gonzaga and see their shooting percentages go up. I think Adam Miller is also going to benefit from that too. But I really think it's going to be a great situation where he's not if he can kind of just buy into a role of doing what you need him to do. It's not going to be, leading the team and scoring every night, but he's going to have plenty of chances to lead the team scoring and win games. I think he's really going to benefit. And again, I think he's kind of the X factor for this team because of all he can do. And he's going to have a chance to maybe defend at a higher level because he's not asked to score 20, 25 points a game now.
With Ike and Huff coming back, just such an elite offensive front court, they're going to be so good, but like how dominant could they be? And then defensively, or whether it's shooting, is there any, or I guess passing out of doubles potentially, any areas of growth that we could potentially expect from them?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of fans look at the last 3 games last year and see what those two did starting together for the first time and wonder, why weren't we doing this the whole season? Because you just had such inconsistent play at the 4 last year from Ben Gregg and Michael Ajayi. And I think the staff believed that one of those two would kind of emerge eventually. And Greg had been there so long and really had been a successful player the last handful of years and was a great shooter. And then, you obviously saw so much, NBA potential with Ajayi as far as his athleticism and what he could do defensively, but it just never really panned out at that position. So, entering the conference tournament, they still played with that traditional lineup in the San Francisco game in the semifinals. And then obviously they get the annual matchup with St. Mary's in the final. It's become kind of just something you pencil in on your calendar now, those two meeting in the championship game. And they had lost 2 games to St. Mary's and decided to switch it up. And, Mark Few's point after the game was we really wanted to kind of exploit the matchup at the 4 with Paulius Morauskas, who was the newcomer of the year in the WCC. And if we can put Huff on him, then it really puts kind of Morauskas at a mismatch, and worked out. They won the St. Mary's game and then, dominated Georgia. And then, Graham Ike and Huff combined for 38 points against Houston. And Ike had 27 in that game, which, I think Ike and Cooper Flagg were the only 2 players on Houston's schedule that season to score 27 points. So really shows how dominant Ike was in that game. And I think he benefited from playing next to Huff. And so I also think they really wanted to show Huff that if you come back, we have a place for you in the starting lineup. It is going to work playing next to Ike. And I think there was a real concern that if you weren't going to start Braden Huff, then is he going to look to transfer elsewhere because he's going to be a 4th-year junior, and so he's kind of paid his dues. And I think they kind of owed him that starting spot finally, but just needed to show him that, hey, come back. If Graham's going to come back, we're going to make it work between you two. And so I think that 3-game sample was partially about kind of the matchup with St. Mary's, but also if you're Mark Few, you had to retain Braden Huff this year, and he was such a big piece. So I just think those two are going to be just so dominant, and you just don't see too many teams that that have one player like a Braden Huff or a Graham Mike, let alone two. So scoring wise, offense wise, I think they're going to be a great tandem. The concerns with those two, obviously, neither of them are rim protectors. Graham Mike and Huff actually, both had a tendency to get into foul trouble sometimes in the same game. If you go back to the Santa Clara game on the road that they won, both got into foul trouble pretty early in the first half, and they had to kind of play through Ismaila Diane, and luckily he had the game of his life, and they were able to pull out that win down at Santa Clara. But until those two show that they can consistently stay out of foul trouble, that's going to be kind of a lingering concern. And then the defense. I talked to Mark Few when I saw him at Summer League in Vegas this July, and he said, those two guys are going to have to defend. So I don't think they're going to play a ton of teams with dominant post players. You just don't see that too often in this day and age of college basketball. But I think if both of those two can't take a defensive step for a team that wasn't so great defensively last year, I think that'll be really important too.
This team could be one of the oldest lineups. Like this team,
yeah,
like field one of the oldest lineups we've ever seen in college basketball. One of those guys being Adam Miller, who had a nice freshman year at Illinois, goes to LSU. Missed a year in between the 2 years at Arizona State, and last year Arizona State was by far his most efficient season, kind of scaling back a little bit and just being a really good 3-and-D guy, 45% from deep last year. Tell me about the acquisition of Adam Miller, and if you expect him to slot in there at the starting 2 spot.
Yeah, well, first of all, you mentioned the age, and I think I went through this like 2 or 3 months ago. I think this was after maybe after Tyon committed, and you realize he's going to be potentially, if he's playing with Gonzaga, which we assume, he's going to be 26 by March. And so, I think they're going to have 4 or 5 guys that are 23 years of age or older, whereas you see a lot of teams that have 5 players who are under 20 this day and age. So I think it'll be interesting to have such an older and mature team. Even the juniors on this team, Braden Huff is a 4th-year junior, and Braden Smith is a 4th-year junior. So even the juniors are older than normal. But I think Miller is the guy right now to slide into that 2 spot. I think they're hoping he can do a lot of what Nolan Hickman did as far as being a catch and shoot player who can create a little bit, but they're not going to ask him to do too much creation wise. Nolan Hickman really developed that kind of mid-range floater that Julian Strother kind of perfected when he was here. And so Hickman said last year that was one thing he really wanted to kind of get down was the Strother floater. So if Miller can add that to his game, I think he's going to really benefit from, again, kind of like I mentioned with Tyon, the attention around him. And I think he will have plenty of catch and shoot opportunities, open opportunities. Whereas I think playing for a team like ASU, you probably didn't have quite as much room to operate. So I think, again, everyone benefits from coming to Gonzaga and having the attention that EK and Huff and Grant Foster are going to draw. I think it's going to be a good situation. But again, for a player like him, he's going to have to defend, ideally better than Hickman did last year. And this is a team that's really kind of, you look at it on paper, and at least when you look at the 4 to 5 guys who are going to be projected to start, there's not a lot of defensive standouts there. So he's going to have to defend and also make threes at a high level, because those are kind of the 2 deficiencies, at least on paper, that you look at: defense, wing defense, perimeter defense, and shooting. So if he can kind of focus on being a 3-and-D player, they obviously have players who can fill in the gaps elsewhere. I think he probably just kind of looked at Gonzaga like Caleb Battle did last year and said, my career's winding down, and putting up numbers at this point isn't quite as important as winning and being on a big stage and getting exposure that Gonzaga gets when they play in these big non-conference games and in the second weekend of the tournament. So I think he's going to have to fit into the system and kind of do the same thing that Battle did last year, where he might be sacrificing a few shots and some numbers, but he's going to have 2 or 3 games where he might have a chance to make 6 or 7 threes and score 30 points.
Steele Venters, the poor guy, ACL and Achilles the same time, back-to-back years. This was the Big Sky Player of the Year in 2023. I saw you post that he won the 3-point contest and played in the scrimmage. What can we expect from Steele Venters? I shout out to him for even being in a position to play at all, but could he be somewhat 80% of the player he was before these brutal injuries?
Yeah, he's another guy that I think might be 24, 25 years old now, just with all the time he spent in college. Yeah, just I mean, the most kind of unfortunate sequence of injuries you can have as a basketball player. If you're an NBA fan, and I'm a Warriors fan, so I saw Klay Thompson go through the same thing and come out on the other side, and still be a very effective, successful shooter. So I'm actually kind of interested in Klay Thompson, and Still Ventures have the same agent. So I talked to Steele this summer and asked if he had had a chance to kind of connect with Klay about going through the same injuries in back-to-back years, and he said he hadn't, but I think he was hoping to make that connection at some point. I think the expectation for Steele is that he can contribute in any capacity. I don't think they're obviously expecting him to come in and start. I think if he can come in and be a bench player and do what he does, which is shoot at a really high clip and be one of the nation's best catch and shoot shooters, I think that's what you can expect. And again, I think he's got the capability to do something that not a lot of players on this roster can. And we saw that during Craziness, where he, like you mentioned, won the 3-point contest and then made 3 threes, and that was pretty much his stat line was going 3 of 6 from the 3-point line. And I don't think he had any rebounding stats, any assist stats. So he's coming in to be a shooter, and that's something that they didn't really have a whole lot of last year outside of Nolan Hickman. So I think this year, if you can really rely on Adam Miller and Ventures to be your 2 shooters, and having one in the starting lineup and having one off the bench, I think that's going to be a step forward. But again, for Ventures, he still hasn't played a game in a Gonzaga uniform despite being on campus for 2 years. So he can kind of get to the starting line and play in that Texas Southern game, and just have confidence that he can move the same way. That was the one thing he mentioned to me when I talked to him this summer, was building confidence and in his lower body, and just being able to move and not having the injuries in the back of his mind. I think is more of a mental thing than a physical thing. And obviously cleared to play, and he looked pretty good, running around, moving laterally, running up and down the court on Saturday. So all things look positive, but again, he still has to get to that Texas Southern game healthy.
Let's get into the point guard position now. So we've got Braden Smith from Colgate and Jalen Worley from Florida State. Brief stint at Virginia before Tony Bennett calls it quits. So both these guys were with the program last year. I think Braden got there earlier than Worley, but so 12, 5, and 6 for Braden at Colgate. Was a really good defender, 2 steals a game. Only shot 31% from deep, but has a range to shoot off the bounce. And then Worley, I remember being really high on him. I saw him play in person when he was a freshman at Florida State, and I'm like, this big guard is a freak. He was a top recruit. The shot just never came along at all. I don't even think he made like a few threes his sophomore year at Florida State. But a big guard who can defend and get to the rim. So kind of setting the table with those 2 guys. I think Braden has the upper hand at being the starter, but just being used to such high level point guard play the past few years at Gonzaga, what's kind of the plan with these 2?
Yeah, well, actually, I don't think they view Worley as a 1 at all. I think he actually even it's funny, he played a little bit of 4 during
really.
So I could see him playing primarily 3, and then playing a little bit of 4 in kind of some of the smaller lineups and pairing with Ike or Huff. I think when you're looking at the point guards, it's Braden Smith that you mentioned. He's spent a year learning the system. He was did a really good job of monitoring Ryan Nembhard, and every game last year he would write a little, like a 1 to 2 page report from every game, just as far as what he saw. And he worked really closely with the coaching staff. And I really think he's kind of a student of the game, and he's a lot of similarities to Nembhard as far as just their approach and their maturity, kind of how they played the position. I mean, ideally you want Smith to be a better defender than Nembhard was, and hopefully he can make shots at a pretty consistent level. But Smith I expect to be their starting point guard, but I wouldn't be shocked if at some point in the season, Mario St. Superi is kind of challenging for that spot. They're really high on him. Like I said, when I talked to Mark Few in July, and Mario had only just signed, he said, Mario's going to play a lot. He's going to play. He's a point guard. They like to have 2 ball handlers in the lineup a lot of times. So whether that's Braden and Mario, or Mario and someone else, I think he's going to see a lot of floor time. He's a bigger guard. He didn't shoot it too well on Saturday, but I think he's capable of shooting at a 35% clip or so. Has a lot of experience now with the Spanish national team. Was one of their top bench players in Eurobasket recently, and was actually kind of their standout player in that their last group stage game against Greece and Giannis, and kind of took over in the second half of that game. And so he's someone who has a lot of expectations as far as being kind of the future of the Spanish national team. He was the only Gonzaga player on Bleacher Report's last mock draft. So kind of interesting. I think they have a lot of hopes for him. I'm not sure if he's going to be a one and done guy, but
wow.
I think they love him. And he's still adjusting to the American game. It's going to be a lot different than, he played in the top flight in Spain, played for Unicaja, and then Baxi Manresa last year. And so he's someone that they're really high on. He can create really well. And I think he's going to kind of have a say in how things go. And I think the hope is that he just kind of progresses throughout the year. And Braden Smith just has such an advantage being there for a year and kind of being more of an experienced college player. But don't be shocked if, like in December, they have a tough decision to make as far as who's playing the majority of the point guard minutes there.
That's really interesting. I didn't get to see him play in that. But I mean, I'm just looking at the roster and I'm just seeing when the strength of your team is these two post players and you've got Grant Foster and then you've got snipers like Miller and Venters and then Smith as the point guard who just got a year studying behind Nemhard. And then you throw in St. Supri and telling me that he's a guy that could be the NBA guy out of the group is really intriguing to me. A couple other guys that could factor in here. Innocenti definitely scaled up as the season went along. He played 21 minutes against Houston. Obviously a defensive-minded player. I assume he'll be kind of in the same position as, like, depending on matchups, like how valuable he is. Is there anything to share on Innocenti?
Yeah, I think right now, if they started the season tomorrow, I think he's their starting three, just because he has more experience and he kind of overtook Dusty Stromer last year in the rotation, especially during the tournament. And so just because Grant Foster again has practiced 2 to 3 times now, maybe 4 times by the time we've done this podcast, but I think Innocenti has kind of the experience in the system, and I think they really like what he can bring defensively. Again, like I mentioned, Afanike aren't defensive specialists. Braden Smith defended well at Colgate, but we'll kind of see how that translates to playing against teams like Kentucky and Alabama and Oklahoma and Creighton. But and then Adam Miller, again, not really known for what he can do defensively. So I think you really need someone on the wing who can kind of defend opposing wings, opposing guards. This was a team last year that gave up 200 points in consecutive games to Oregon State and Santa Clara, and I think at that point of the year, I think 8 different players on opposing teams had scored their season high or career high against Gonzaga. So I think you just need someone who can be assigned to, kind of like Anton Watson was, when he was at Gonzaga. Just if Innocenti can guard the opposing team's best player, if someone's erupting, then you can stick him on that guy and hope to kind of contain him. I think he's going to be that guy, and he can shoot at a decent level. He's not going to be 40% guy most likely, but he's a reliable kind of catch and shoot guy, and he's not going to create a whole lot either, unless he's kind of improved that aspect of his game. But you can rely on him as a 3-and-D guy, and I think he's really solid. And you just look at his frame; he's really long, stout, and I think he's taken a big jump. I think he's someone who is easily in the rotation. And again, I think he starts the year in that 3 spot, and then ideally, Tylen Grant Foster has spent enough time in the system by November, late November, December, that he can kind of slide into that role. But I think those 3 are going to take the majority of the minutes at the 3.
Davis Fogel, the freshman, pretty good recruit. Is he a guy that you think could contribute this year?
Yeah, I think you're going to see him in a lot of games just because they're playing games where they're going to be up by 30 points at halftime, and I think he's going to be more of an end of the bench guy. But I think knock on wood, if certain guys can't play, if something happens again with Ventures, which God forbid, hopefully it doesn't. But I think if he comes in and has to play, I don't think you feel terrible about a lineup with him in it. He played last season at AZ Compass Prep, which obviously plays a national schedule, and played against some of the top schools in the country. And he was the MVP of a game against Montverde, I think, at the Hoop Hall Classic, and played at a really high level in high school. And I think he's someone, if he has to play, I don't think it's a terrible thing. I don't know if he's one of your top options, but I think he's kind of toward the end of the bench, and I think he's going to see spot minutes in certain games if there's foul trouble or injuries. And again, there's usually a lot of chances in WCC play for these guys to kind of get minutes in the second half. So overall,
the depth and optionality that this roster has compared to the last couple seasons seems really interesting to me. It feels like there's guys who are like very defensive minded and very offensive minded. There's less guys who are 2-way players. So yeah. I don't know if it's schematically or just the way Few's been kind of emphasizing things this offseason. Like, what is the plan, I guess, to just being as best as possible on that end of the floor?
Yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting month for Mark Few and his staff, because I think it's like just putting the puzzle pieces together in the best way you can. Like you said, there's a lot of guys who are great defenders and aren't known for doing much else. Jalen Worley, Emmanuel Inocenti, even Ismaila Diane, who's going to be their probably their third center. And, he had to play last year against Santa Clara. I wouldn't be shocked if he's getting minutes in certain games where, you're playing against a 7-footer that you just kind of want to have another 7-footer and use up his fouls. And, but he's not a great finisher on the rim. He's not known for his post moves. So, but then again, you have Venters and Miller who are shooters, and then you have the point guards. And so I think there's so many different lineup options. Whereas last year you kind of had at least 4 of your 5 starters that you kind of knew that they're going to play the majority of the minutes. You kind of knew what your 7-8 man rotation looked like. Where again this year I think you have 10 to 12 guys who legitimately could station minutes, and it's going to be about putting together a lineup that's going to score the ball, as much as Gonzaga likes to score, but also, you kind of have to be top 30 team defensively, top 40 team defensively to make a second weekend run. And last year, they just weren't that, and grew on that end as the season wore on. But, they just lost a lot of these early non-conference games because they didn't defend and couldn't close out games. So, when you're Gonzaga, you need to take advantage of the non-conference opportunities, and you don't need to win all your quad 1 games, but you can't, lose, all but 2 of them by, a possession or 2. So they're going to have to kind of gel early, which is going to be interesting because last year you had an older team that had played together, and, that team couldn't really win these close games. And now you're kind of relying on a team that hasn't spent a lot of time together, and, 3 guys who haven't played competitive basketball in more than a year. And then Tyon Grant Foster is in the equation. So it's going to be kind of interesting to see how they come together early, and if they can win some of these early games. And if you can win half of them, you're in pretty good shape entering conference play, and then you'll have a few more chances against St. Mary's and San Francisco and Santa Clara. But it's going to be interesting to see what the lineup looks like on night 1 and kind of how it changes throughout the year. Because again, as guys like Saint Superi and Tyon Grant Foster become better acclimated, are they going to overtake some of the guys who are in their spots? And is Mark Few going to play Huff and Ike together for 30 minutes or just 20 minutes? So there's just a lot of variables, and I would hate to be the coaching staff right now, but I would also I think they've got a luxury of riches because they have so many different guys who can play and contribute. And I think they just have to decide what they want to be as far as more offensive minded or defensive minded, or try to do the best of both worlds.
Few has earned the benefit of the doubt, where when he's got a roster anywhere close to this talent, just with this track record, it's going to be a top 10 offense. They're going to be incredibly hard to stop on that end of the floor. And not that it all just boils down to defense, but I feel like that's where the kind of ceiling can be unlocked. The last thing before I get you out of here, I'm really intrigued by Saint Superi. What is the best case scenario for him? Is there a world where he's starting the entire season, where he's the second leading scorer behind Ike, that he's, like you said, popping up on draft boards, that he's gone? Build the hype for him a little bit more from him.
Well, yeah. So I think best case scenario for fans is that he's not starting and doesn't show what he's capable of, because I think fans would love him to be here next year, and be more than a 1-year guy. And again, I'm not at all projecting him to be a one and done player. They've only had 3 of those in school history, and that was Collins, Suggs, and Holmgren. So it would be putting a lot on his table for him to be in that conversation. And if he is, then I think this is probably a Elite 8, Final Four type team. If he becomes that, obviously I'm not expecting it, but I think he's going to have to kind of take the backup role to Smith, because Smith has become kind of a vocal leader within the team. I think he's going to be one of their veteran leaders, and he's commanded a lot of respect the last year. And I think a lot of people respected him for coming to a place like Gonzaga and being willing to redshirt, where I think he had offers from schools like Cal and other high majors where he could have come in and started right away for teams that probably weren't going to make the tournament. But he's a Seattle native and wanted to come back home and really learn from a coaching staff that's put a lot of point guards into the NBA. So I don't see him starting the whole season. I think best case scenario for him is that maybe after a few months, he's shown enough to where they just can't kind of ignore him, because he's 6'4", 6'5". He's got a lot of length on Smith, and he can create kind of the same way Smith can. And I think score at a higher level, and maybe potentially shoot at a higher level, defend at a higher level. So I think best case scenario is that he emerges as someone who has to make a really tough decision in April as far as whether he wants to come back to Gonzaga or potentially go to the NBA. But again, he's played in the Liga ACB, which a lot of people would consider the second best league in the world after the NBA. Maybe the Australian league is kind of in that conversation, but he's played at that level for 2 years. He's played in Eurobasket against Giannis, and he just has a lot of experience that college freshmen don't have. So I think there's a lot of expectations, and I think for him it's about acclimating to the American game, which is admittedly a lot different than what he's used to. And a lot of international guys need a year or two to kind of acclimate. But he actually came from the same team in Spain that Domantas Sabonis kind of grew up in Unicaja in Malaga, and I've talked to a few people at that program. And I asked him, who was the last player that was at this level at that age? As far as coaches who've been with Mario, since he was 11 years old, and they said Domantas Sabonis. So they're really high on him, and obviously a lot of things can go wrong or go right. But I think he's someone who's going to, potentially have to play at least 20 minutes a game for this team, and I really think he's going to grow into if not a rotation player, then potentially a starter who plays in certain matchups and starts in other games. And not to say that Smith won't, take a hold of that job, but I think it'll be a really interesting battle between those two come December when Mario's had a little bit more time, adjusting to the American game and to Gonzaga's system.
One final question: is Braden Smith going to be put into ball, especially at the beginning of the year, like kind of be put into ball screens as much as Ryan Nembhard was? Obviously, you played through the post with that. That was just kind of the initiation of action. We saw so much, and just kind of being his understudy. I feel like that's kind of what I'm expecting. But is that?
Yeah, I think that's the hope. I really think they're not not identical, and I don't want to compare Smith to Nembhard right away, because Nembhard set all these assist records last year, and was the nation's best passer. And if you want to argue that he wasn't the nation's best point guard overall, I would listen to that argument. But yeah, I really think they're not going to have to change their system a whole lot. I think he slides into the Nembhard role, and Miller slides into the Hickman role, and I think they want to kind of play similar to last year. And he's going to have a lot of post entries to Braden Huff and Graham Ike, and then those two, I think, in their 2-man game, it's going to be interesting to see how they work off each other. And we saw little glimpses of that toward the end of last year, where they both can command double teams, but they're both really good passers. So I think you're going to see Smith in all the same ball screen actions, and Nembhard and both Nembhards actually, Ryan and Andrew, were probably Gonzaga's best 2 point guards, and as far as I can remember, is operating in those ball screens. So I don't think it's expected that Smith will do that right away at that level, but I think he's going to kind of be in that same role. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks again for coming on the show, Theo, and breaking it all down with me. I'm excited because I feel like people are acting like the championship window has closed on Gonzaga. They missed their prime chances. I'm not saying this team's going to do it, but I think they're a little under the radar, and you never know if they come out in November and December, they're firing. They stack those Q1 wins. You never know what can happen. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, I've obviously, I'm on Twitter too much, and I see a lot of that same conversation. And, I think people forget that, teams like Kansas and Kentucky and Duke go through 2 or 3 year spans where they're not making the national title game, and the ceiling's falling for them too. So, the fact that Gonzaga has managed to keep this, Sweet 16 streak going for 9 years, and again, we're one possession, away from extending that streak last year and, upsetting Houston. I'm not looking at this team as like, if they don't make the Final Four, it's going to be a disappointing year. But whenever you have a marquee team and you have talented post players, I think they're going to be in the mix. And again, like you mentioned, they have to capitalize on these quad win games against Alabama and Oregon and UCLA, Kentucky, the likes of those teams. So if they can do that, they'll be right in the mix and not slip up too many times in West Coast Conference play. I think they'll kind of be there in March and hopefully get a higher seed to where you don't have to play Houston in the second round.
All right. Thanks again, Theo.
Yep. Thank you.